The gates at the Harlan County Fairgrounds opened at 8 that morning, and by the time the first truck chained up, 4,300 people had come through them. Most had already made up their minds. It was the kind of September day Kentucky sometimes gives you as an apology for August. The humidity had let go overnight. The air had broken, and the sky sat at that particular shade of deep blue that only arrives after a long heat has finally passed. By 10 o'clock, the grandstands were full. People had driven in from Harlan and Cumberland, from Lynch and Avarts, and a handful had come from as far as Whitesburg and Middlesboro, because word had traveled the way it travels in that part of the country. Co-op bulletin boards, Sunday parking lots after church, that particular telephone chain that activates in a rural county when something worth watching is about to happen on a fairground infield. The pull was billed as a memorial. Ray Combs had passed the previous November, and the county had organized the event in his name. That was why his granddaughter Emma had driven down from Lexington that morning with a truck she hadn't touched in 4 years, parked on a borrowed trailer, hauled behind a pickup that was older than her youngest brother. 3 hours and 40 minutes on the road to get there. She'd backed the truck off the trailer herself in the staging area, and while she worked the ramps and the chocks alone. 3 members of the Tri-State Diesel Motorsports team stood 20 feet away and watched her do it. The Tri-State truck was a purpose-built superstock diesel pulling machine, and it was the most expensive thing in that infield by a margin that was not close. The team had trailered it from Knoxville in a custom enclosed hauler with the team name stenciled on the side in 2-foot block letters, and the truck itself sat on beadlock wheels under a body that had been stripped to its structural essentials and repainted in a deep metallic blue that caught the morning light like a piece of industrial jewelry. The engine had been built by a shop in Kingsport that specialized in nothing else. The turbocharger alone had cost more than Emma Combs had paid for her first car. The team had 4 people just to manage the staging process: a driver, a crew chief, a fuel technician, and a man whose only job appeared to be standing near the front of the truck looking at it. Emma's truck was a 1979 Dodge Power Wagon. It was the color of old rust over primer, with a hand-lettered number on the door that she'd put there herself the night before with a piece of masking tape and a can of spray paint. The Cummins NTC 350 under the hood had been her grandfather's engine. Pulled from a highway truck he'd bought for parts in 1988 and installed in the Dodge over the course of a winter that he'd described, in the one conversation she remembered about it, as the best winter of his life. The truck had not been in a pull since 2019. It had not been driven on a road since 2020. It had been sitting in a machine shed on the Combs property outside of Baxter for 4 years, under a canvas tarp, next to a workbench that still had her grandfather's coffee mug on it. When Emma had backed the truck off the trailer and climbed down from the cab, one of the Tri-State crew members had walked over and looked at the Power Wagon the way a surgeon looks at a piece of folk medicine. He hadn't said anything. He didn't need to. The look was the sentence. She put her hand flat on the fender and didn't look back at him. Now, I need to stop here and tell you about Ray Combs before I tell you what happened on that strip. Because without knowing who he was, this story is just a truck pull. And it is not just a truck pull. Ray Combs was born in 1941 in a holler outside of Baxter, Kentucky, the second of 5 children, and he had spent the first 20 years of his life being told by the geography of that county that there were limits to what a man from there could expect. He had decided, sometime in his late teens, that this was incorrect. He had not left. He had stayed, and he had worked, and he had built something on the land his father had left him that was, by the time Emma was old enough to understand it, a function and beef cattle operation of 340 acres, with a machine shop attached to the barn that contained tools he had purchased over the course of 4 decades and maintained with the kind of care that most people reserve for things that cannot be replaced. He had been a diesel mechanic before he was a farmer, and he had been both at the same time for most of his adult life. He'd worked for a coal company out of Harlan for 11 years, maintaining the heavy equipment that ran the preparation plants, the crushers, the conveyors, the haul trucks, and he'd learned engines the way you learn them when they cannot be wrong, when a failure is not an inconvenience but a shutdown that costs $10,000 an hour. He had learned to think about engines not as machines but as systems, and the difference between those two framings, he had told Emma once when she was 12 years old and sitting on a stool in the machine shop watching him work, was the difference between fixing something and understanding something. He had pulled trucks competitively from 1978 to 1994, not professionally, not with sponsorship or a team or a trailer, but in the county and regional pulls that ran through eastern Kentucky in those years, driving whatever he had built in the shed behind the barn, winning more than he lost, and never once painting any of it. When people asked him why he didn't clean the truck up, he had a single answer that Emma had heard so many times she could say it in his voice. He'd say, "If I painted it, they'd take it seriously. I don't want them to take it seriously." He meant it. He wanted the distance to do the talking. He'd retired from pulling in 1994 when Emma's mother was pregnant with Emma's older brother, and he'd turned the machine shed over to practical work. The farm equipment, the neighbors' tractors, the occasional diesel pickup that someone brought out on a Saturday morning with a problem they couldn't diagnose. He'd kept the NTC 350 in the Dodge, and he'd kept the Dodge running, and he'd taken it to one pull in 2019, a small county event in Bell County, and finished second. He was 78 years old. He died in November of the following year in the farmhouse he'd been born in, with Emma's mother and 2 of her uncles in the room. He left Emma the truck because she was the one who'd sat on the stool in the machine shop. She was the one who'd asked the questions. She was the one who, at 12 years old, had listened when he explained the difference between fixing and understanding. She had covered it with the tarp and left it where it was. She had her own life in Lexington, her own job, her own apartment. She was not a mechanic. She was a civil engineer, which meant she understood load and force and material limits in the abstract. But she had never rebuilt an engine, never set injection timing, never done anything to a diesel beyond the kind of maintenance that a parts store employee walks you through over the phone. When the county called about the memorial pull, she had said yes before she'd thought about what yes meant. Then she'd driven out to Baxter on a Thursday evening in late July and pulled the tarp off the truck and stood in the machine shed with the overhead light on and looked at it for a long time. Now, I need you to stay with me for a few minutes here, because what I'm about to explain is the intellectual key to everything that happened on that strip. Most people watching a truck pull see power and noise and smoke, and they assume that the loudest, most spectacular truck is the one that wins. That assumption is wrong, and understanding why it's wrong is the only way to understand what Emma Combs did that September. A truck pull works like this. A weighted sled sits on the track, and as the truck pulls it forward, the weight transfers progressively toward the front of the sled, increasing the resistance against the ground. The longer you pull, the heavier it gets. A full pull, the entire length of the track, which at most events is 300 feet, requires not just power, but the specific kind of power that can sustain force under increasing load without breaking down. Here is the distinction that matters. Horsepower and torque are related, but they are not the same thing, and in a truck pull, they are not equally valuable. Horsepower is the rate at which an engine does work. It's what you feel when an engine screams up through its RPM range and accelerates. Torque is the rotational force the engine produces, and it is what you feel when an engine pulls hard at low RPM, when it leans into a load and refuses to be stopped. Most modern performance diesel builds chase peak horsepower numbers because peak horsepower is what sounds impressive on a dyno sheet. But peak horsepower happens at the top of the RPM range, and when you're pulling a sled that is getting heavier with every foot, an engine that peaks at the top of its range will fall off the power band as the load increases and the engine bogs down. It will spin tires, it will lose traction, it will make noise and smoke and fall short. A Cummins NTC 350 is a big cam inline six-cylinder diesel that was designed in the 1970s to move highway trucks, 80,000-pound combinations, up mountain grades at sustained load. It was not designed to be fast. It was designed to be relentless. Its peak torque arrives at approximately 1,200 revolutions per minute, which is barely above idle, and it holds that torque across a wide band before it begins to fall off. In the language of engine curves, the NTC 350 has what engineers call a flat torque curve. It produces nearly maximum force across a broad range of engine speeds rather than spiking at a narrow peak. This is the engine characteristic of a draft horse, not a racehorse, not a sprint. A sustained, patient, irresistible lean into the collar that does not care how heavy the load gets because it was built for heavy loads. What Ray Combs had done to that engine over the years was not dramatic. There were no exotic components, no billet aluminum, no aftermarket turbocharger from a specialty shop in Kingsport. What he had done was methodical. He had blueprinted the engine, measured every clearance, every tolerance, every dimension against the factory specification, and corrected anything that had drifted, so that the engine ran exactly as its designers had intended, which is rarer than it sounds. He had rebuilt the injection pump to factory spec and then advanced the timing by a precise amount that he had arrived at through testing, not guessing, over the course of several years of pulls in the late 1980s. He had matched the injectors to each other so that all 6 cylinders contributed equally to the power stroke. He had built a cold air intake that routed outside air directly to the turbocharger inlet. He had done none of this to make the engine louder or more spectacular. He had done it to make the engine more exactly itself. Emma had found his notebook on the workbench next to the coffee mug. It was a standard composition book, the kind with the black and white marbled cover, and it contained 40 pages of measurements, dates, test results, and notes in her grandfather's handwriting. Injection timing, 19 degrees before top dead center. Peak torque, RPM after rebuild, 1,180. Track temperature effect on traction, note on clay moisture. She had read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. Then she had read it a 4th time and started making phone calls. She had called a retired Cummins dealer technician named Harold Fitch, who had known her grandfather since the 1970s, and who drove out to Baxter on a Saturday morning in August and spent 4.5 hours in the machine shed without sitting down. He went through the engine top to bottom, checking every specification against the notebook. He found 3 things that needed attention: a cracked injector cup on cylinder 4, a worn cross-shaft bushing in the injection pump, and a small boost leak at the intake manifold. And he fixed all three of them while Emma handed him tools and watched. When he was done, he stood up and wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the engine for a moment. He said, "Your grandfather built this engine on purpose." She asked him what he meant. He said, "Most people build an engine to get a number. Your grandfather built this one to get the shape of the curve." She didn't fully understand that until September. The morning of the pull, Emma arrived at the Harlan County Fairgrounds at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before the gates opened, and spent the time going through the truck the way she had watched Harold Fitch go through it, methodically, with the notebook open on the fender, checking each item in sequence. She tightened the intake clamps. She checked the fuel system for air. She verified the timing mark. She checked the tire pressure in all four corners and wrote the numbers down. She was still doing this when the tri-state hauler pulled into the staging area, and she watched the team unload their truck with the peripheral attention of someone who is busy with something more important. The tri-state driver's name was Cody Marsh, and he was 26 years old and had been pulling competitively for 4 years. He was not a bad person. He was confident the way young people are confident when they have good equipment and a team behind them and a record of winning, and that confidence expressed itself that morning as a kind of ambient dismissal of anything that didn't look like what he was used to seeing. He'd walked over to look at the Power Wagon with his crew chief, and they'd talked quietly, and one of them had laughed, and Emma had heard it and had not looked up from the tire she was checking. There was a boy at the fence near the staging area. He was maybe 9 years old, wearing a Harlan County 4-H shirt, and he had been watching Emma work for 20 minutes with the focused attention of a child who has decided that something is more interesting than everything else available. At some point, he called out to her and asked which truck was going to win. She thought about it for a second. She said, "The one that knows what it's doing." He seemed to accept that. The tri-state truck pulled at 1:15 in the afternoon, and it was everything a crowd expects from a purpose-built pulling machine. The engine started with a sound like controlled detonation, the exhaust stacks throwing a column of black smoke straight up in the dead calm air. Cody Marsh staged the truck with professional efficiency, the crew chief talking into his ear through a headset, and when the light went green, the truck launched with a violence that sent a wave of sound across the grandstands and brought 4,000 people to their feet. The tires bit and held, and the sled moved, and the truck pulled through the first 100 feet in a surge of power that was genuinely spectacular to watch. At 150 feet, the sled resistance was climbing, and the engine note began to shift, climbing in pitch as the load increased, and by 200 feet Marsh was working the throttle, trying to hold the power band, the tires beginning to break loose in short, stuttering chirps on the clay. He held it together. He was good. The truck ground through 225 feet and 240 feet, and at 252 feet, the engine finally came off the power band and the tires spun free and the sled stopped moving. 252 feet. The crowd gave it what it deserved, which was a full-throated roar, because 252 feet was a serious pull, and Cody Marsh had driven it well. The announcer said the number twice. People in the grandstands were writing it down. Emma had watched from the staging area. She had her hand on the fender of the Power Wagon. She had not written the number down because she didn't need to. She staged the truck at 2:43 in the afternoon, in the last slot of the class. The sun had moved enough to put the track in partial shadow, and the air temperature had dropped 3 degrees from its afternoon peak, which meant the air was slightly denser, which meant the turbocharger was working with a fractionally better charge, which was a small thing, but not nothing. She had noted the temperature when she checked the truck at noon, and she had noted it again when she pulled on her gloves, and she had thought about what Harold Fitch had said about the shape of the curve. She drove the truck to the starting line herself, without a crew, without a headset. She climbed out and hooked the chain herself, checking the hook with both hands, and then she climbed back in and sat for a moment with the engine at idle. The crowd had been watching with the particular quality of attention that a fairground crowd gives to something it has already decided about. There was laughter in the grandstands when the Power Wagon had driven to the line, not cruel laughter, but the easy, reflexive laughter of people who see a rust-colored 1979 Dodge next to the memory of a purpose-built blue machine and make the obvious calculation. The announcer had read the truck's information from the entry form and paused for a beat when he got to the engine designation, and someone in the crowd had said something that got a laugh from the people around them. Emma put the truck in gear. Now I want you to understand what happened next, because it did not look the way the crowd expected it to look. The truck moved from the line the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar, without drama, without the violence of a launch, without the column of black smoke that had announced the tri-state machine. The engine came up through its low registers with a sound that was not a scream, but a note. A deep, sustained, authoritative note that seemed to come from somewhere below the ground rather than from under the hood. And the tires found the clay and pressed into it and did not spin. At 50 feet, the crowd had gone quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something is not matching their expectation. At 100 feet, the sled resistance was climbing and the engine note had not changed. It had not climbed in pitch. It had not broken. It was the same note, the same RPM, the same steady application of force, and the sled was moving at the same speed it had been moving at 50 feet, which was not fast but was not stopping. At 150 feet, Emma had not moved in the cab. She was not working the throttle. She was not fighting the truck. She had her hands on the wheel and her eyes on the track, and she was doing almost nothing, because the engine was doing what it had been built to do, and it did not need her help. Here's what was happening in the engine at that moment. The NTC 350 was turning at approximately 1,400 revolutions per minute, which put it squarely in the middle of its peak torque band. The injection timing that Ray Combs had advanced by those precise degrees was putting fuel into the cylinder at the exact moment that produced maximum pressure on the piston crown. All 6 injectors, matched to within thousandths of a cubic centimeter of each other, were contributing equal power strokes. The turbocharger, fed by dense September air through the cold air intake, was producing boost pressure that was building the charge in the cylinder to exactly the density the engine had been designed to use. There was no wasted energy. There was no inefficiency. The engine was running exactly as its designer had intended, and its designer had intended it to move mountains. At 175 feet, the crowd had stopped laughing. There was a different quality to the silence now. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of attention. The silence of 4,000 people recalibrating. At 200 feet, someone in the grandstand stood up. At 225 feet, more people stood. At 252 feet, the number, the mark, the distance that Cody Marsh had set with the purpose-built machine, the Power Wagon was still moving. The engine note had not changed. The tires were still in the clay. The chain was still tight. Emma Combs had not moved. The roar that came from the grandstands at that moment was not a polite acknowledgement. It was the involuntary sound that 4,000 people make when something they had decided was impossible turns out to be true. It came up from the bleachers like a physical thing, and it kept building because the truck kept moving. At 260 feet, the sled resistance was at its maximum and the engine was working now. The exhaust note had deepened. The frame was flexing slightly under the load. The tires were pressing into the clay with a force that was leaving continuous impressions rather than the stuttering marks of wheel spin. But the truck was still moving. Slowly, with the absolute patience of something that does not know how to hurry, it was still moving. At 265 feet, a man in the front row of the grandstands put both hands on the rail in front of him and leaned forward. At 270 feet, the truck stopped. Not because the engine quit, not because the tires spun out. The engine was still turning at the same RPM, still producing the same note, still asking the clay for more traction than the clay could give. The truck stopped because the physics of the track had finally equaled the force of the engine, and the two things had arrived at a balance, and the balance held, and neither side could move the other. The announcer said 270 feet. He said it again. Emma sat in the cab for a moment after the truck stopped. The engine was still running. She could feel it through the seat, through the floor, through the steering wheel. That deep, patient note. Still there, not tired, not done, just stopped by the limit of what the ground could hold. She reached down and put the transmission in neutral, and sat there for another few seconds with the engine at idle. Then she climbed out and unhooked the chain herself. Cody Marsh came over while she was doing it. He stood a few feet away and waited until she'd finished and stood up, and then he looked at the truck for a moment and looked at her. He said, "What is that engine?" She said, "NTC 350. Big cam." He was quiet for a second. Then he said, "Who built it?" She said, "My grandfather." He nodded slowly. He looked at the truck again. At the rust, at the masking tape number on the door, at the hand-painted details and the 40 years of honest use in every surface. He said, "How long ago?" She said, "He finished it in 1989. He's been adjusting it since then." Marsh put his hand on the front fender, just for a second, the way you touch something you've just been made to respect. Then he said, "I want to see the injection pump." She said, "I'll show you the notebook." The boy from the fence was there when she walked back to the staging area. He was standing next to the truck with his hands in his pockets, looking at the engine through the open hood that she'd left propped. He looked up at her when she approached and said, "I knew it was going to be you." She asked him why. He thought about it. He said, "Because you were paying attention." She drove home to Lexington that evening with the truck back on the trailer, and she stopped at the rest area outside of London and sat in the parking lot for a while with the radio off. She had the notebook on the passenger seat. She'd taken it from the workbench in the machine shed when she'd gone out to Baxter in July, and she'd been carrying it with her since. She opened it to the first page, which had her grandfather's name at the top in his careful handwriting, and under it a date, and under the date a single line that she had read so many times she no longer needed the light to see it. It said, "The engine doesn't know how to quit. You have to teach it to quit. Don't." She closed the notebook and started the truck and drove home. The Power Wagon is back in the machine shed outside of Baxter. Emma has been out there 4 times since September. Twice by herself, once with Harold Fitch, once with her mother, who had never spent more than 5 minutes in that machine shed in her life, and who stood in the doorway for a long time before she came in. Emma has not painted the truck. She has not entered it in another pull, though she has been asked. She has made 2 small adjustments to the injection timing based on notes in the notebook that she hadn't fully understood until she watched the truck perform. And she's written those adjustments in the same composition book, in her own handwriting below her grandfather's. The tarp is still in the corner. She doesn't use it anymore. Ray Combs spent 30 years building an engine that knew the shape of its own curve, and he spent those same years teaching his granddaughter the difference between fixing something and understanding something. And on the second Saturday of September at the Harlan County Fairgrounds, in front of 4,300 people who had already made up their minds, both of those things turned out to be true at the same time. The ground doesn't lie. The clay, at 270 feet, doesn't care what something cost or how it's painted or whose name is on the side of the trailer. It just tells you what it is. If you know a story like this one, a machine that outlasted the dismissal, a person who understood something the crowd couldn't see, a piece of work that proved itself in a single sustained moment, I want to hear it. Drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that without qualification, because the stories that come in from the people watching this channel are the reason this channel exists. If you're new here, this is what we do. Every week, there is another story about someone who did the quiet work, who built the thing the right way, who didn't need the paint job because they had the distance. If that's the kind of story you want in your life on a regular basis, subscribe and you'll have it. And if this one hit you the way it hit the people standing in those grandstands, if you felt something shift when the truck passed 252 feet and kept going, pass it on to someone who needs it. Stories like this one don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. Ray Combs knew that. He wrote it down in a composition book and left it on a workbench next to a coffee mug for the person who would come looking. She came looking.